Hey guys, Max from Influx here. So back in March, we had the very good fortune of getting to sit down in studio with Dr. Grant Stevens of Marina Plastic Surgery for what turned out to be a fascinating conversation. And this was actually going to be the premiere episode of our new podcast. But it turns out the world had different plans for us. And just a few short days later, COVID-19 became a very real part of all of our lives. So we decided to table this episode for the time being and instead focus on creating other episodes, webinars, and other content that would help our clients and other practices around the country to navigate and adapt to the situation at that time. But looking back now on this episode, what's kind of interesting to me is how it was in many ways somewhat prescient. And I guess what I mean by that is that the conversation that unfolded that day in the studio with Dr. Stevens largely centered around his history as what I like to call a contrarian marketer in the field of aesthetics, and particularly how being early to certain key trends that perhaps others didn't foresee would bear fruit was conducive to success at certain moments throughout his career. To me, I really can't think of a conversation that's more relevant to today as we look around at a world that is rapidly and drastically evolving and try to find a new way forward. So I hope that you find this conversation as fascinating as I did, and I hope it gives you a lens through which to look at the world today and perhaps find opportunity in all this change, and maybe even a silver lining to all the hardship that I know we've all had to endure over these last few months. So I hope you enjoy it. This is Dr. Grant Stevens on Next Level Practices. All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the Next Level Practices podcast. This is the show where we're going to talk about ideas, strategies, and tactics to help you take your medical practice to the next level. And on this show, we're going to hear from industry veterans and emerging thought leaders, technologists, digital marketers, on topics ranging from internal and external marketing, patient experience, patient flow, how to build the right teams and how to motivate and incentivize your teams properly, and the latest technologies to hit the market, and pretty much everything in between. Today, I am joined by my sometimes co-host, Mr. Adam Daniels, and I'm particularly excited to welcome a very special guest and a good friend of mine. You all know him well. He is the one, the only Dr. Grant Stevens of Marina Plastic Surgery. Welcome, Dr. Stevens.
Thank you, Max. Thank you, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here with you, gentlemen, and to be here on the inaugural event is really an honor and a privilege. Thank you very much for having me.
Of course, the honor is all ours. Thank you so much for taking some time to sit down with us today. And I think we should just jump right in, because what I really wanted, what I was so excited to sit down today with you and talk about was, I think when we first met, I think I told you, I'd always, looked up to you as an innovator, of course, in your field, but less directly in the marketing of aesthetics. And I think, you had always had a reputation as someone who pushed those boundaries and was on the forefront of those things. And we've sat around and chatted about it for hours. We can just, do that forever. But I think it's so interesting, and I think people at home, so to speak, would love to hear about some of, you were right there on the forefront when major shifts occurred in the way that marketing occurred in this industry. And I think you even told me, you got some heat for some of it at times.
Yep.
I think that's just all such fascinating subject matter.
Well, I'd love to share with you some of the things that happened.
Yeah, so I think let's go back to before there was even really an internet, right? And you had kind of told me some of the ways that you guys would procure patients back then.
Well, when I first went into practice, dinosaurs roamed the marina, and I would ride a Tyrannosaurus Rex to work. And so things have changed since then. And actually, I went into practice in August of 1986 in Marina del Rey in a small little office, and I was an unknown entity. And I decided I had to get the word out. And so within a couple of years, I decided, well, the best way to do that was to give seminars and publicize myself, basically. I figured if they don't know about me, how are they going to know to come in and so forth? So I actually partnered with the hospital initially and started giving public seminars at the hospital initially, and there was maybe 20 people at my first seminar. I also sent out these newsletters, and the hospital helped me send out invitations. Now, subsequently, they grew to 100 and then 300, and at 300 we had to do 3 nights of 100. And I said, well, this isn't working. So we started using hotels, and then we had to switch hotels. And when we finally stopped, which was in the late 90s, we had 1,000 people a night routinely, and I would warm up in either Orange County or up north of here and do a warm-up a week before just to get everybody back on track. And I would do them twice a year. So I do actually 4 of them a year, one warm-up and then the real show. And they were not well received by my peers, to say the least, especially when I went out of my area. When I would go to Orange County, certain people would give me grief. Some of them would come to the shows, and they were shows. Industry had booths, and they became total shows.
A mini conference almost.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the public loved them. They were called Evenings of Beauty. So come out to an evening of beauty. And we did before and after shots. We had 35 millimeter slide carousels, and I had people at each slide. So there were 2 projectors and then a sound guy. I always had my mom in the audience. At the end, I would run through different parts of the body. And then we'd go to combined surgery. And I would say, now, I'd like to introduce my favorite patient. And invariably, there are patients in the audience. And I'd say, now I want to introduce my favorite patient. It was always my mom. I'd have her come up. She'd pull the winning drawing, out. Somebody got a free gift of some sort from industry. But that's how it started, actually, was with the newsletters and public seminars.
That's amazing. So you would run through slides, run through different parts of the body, showing your before and after pictures at that time.
Right, before and afters with 35 millimeter Kodachrome slides in slide carousels, and people then could stop and ask me questions as we went, and I would tell stories. Here's a patient who came in, and the chief complaint was they're looking tired, and they wanted to do something with their eyelids, and so I would explain what I did and how it affected their life, and we just ran through from head to toe. The body parts, and then, like I said, then we combine surgery, and then some particularly interesting emotional cases, because a lot of people really didn't know what we could do. There were no television programs about plastic surgery, 90210, or anything like that. There were no botched. The public awareness of things we could do was so limited in the late 80s and early 90s, and actually through the 90s.
That's really interesting. That's what I was just going to mention. It seems like everyone coming to these, really the level of public awareness of what went into it, what was available, who was a candidate, how could they address certain things that they might want to address, is they kind of came in knowing so much less than what patients probably know today.
No question about it. No question about it. The knowledge base now with the internet and media is so much different than it was then.
That's an interesting aspect. So then when you say you told stories, you're really telling these patient stories.
Right. I told stories of the different patients. Instead of just saying, here's a before and after, here's a before and after, here's a before and after, I would relate the patient's story each time. And you know what's really interesting? I still have the slide carousels.
Is that right?
Yeah, I'm moving right now, as you know. And I just took the container that holds 4 slide carousels from my old home to my new home and put it in the garage and laughed. I opened it up and looked at the slides. Pulled them out, held them up to the light.
It's so cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. Sometime you have to come by. I have to show them to you.
Okay, I'd love to see
You
them.
won't believe it.
Yeah. I think what's really cool about that, the storytelling, is I think no matter what channel or medium you're working in, that aspect is absolutely the most important. It's paramount in marketing, is tell that story and create that emotional connection. Still important today online. I mean, even on your site, you have these patient stories.
Right.
Where we really tell what that transformation was for this person, what they were trying to overcome, how their life is now. So I think that's really cool that seems to sort of be the backbone of the format was
patient stories.
Was that story. So then we've talked about this. You were the first plastic surgeon, as far as we're aware, to put up a website.
Yeah, I may be the first. I don't know. I don't make that claim necessarily. But however, I can tell you that the first email went out actually from a building across the street from me. And as you know, the internet was created for universities, and it was created to communicate professors one to another. And the emails went out, and I was told about this thing called the internet because it happened in the Trisec building right across the street. And I said, "What's the internet?" And so I started looking into it, and then I bought a web page. Actually, I bought a URL, marinaplasticsurgery.com, and it sat dormant for a while. And then we started developing it at a very rudimentary site, nothing like we have now.
Sure.
And And I recall distinctly thinking, well, patients will want to see, or people will want to see before and after pictures.
Absolutely.
So I helped design this, and I put before and after pictures. And no sooner did I do that I got reprimanded immediately for putting pictures of naked people on a computer. One of my professors, who's now deceased, called me and said, "Why are you putting naked pictures on a computer?" He didn't even know to call it a website.
Right.
And I remember distinctly him saying to me, even a few years later when I was doing a lot of internet marketing, which I'm happy to tell you about, he told me here in the marina at lunch, patients will never find a doctor on a computer.
You've told me this before. And,
yes.
You know, and in now in retrospect, of course, it seems obvious. But at the time, if you really want to look at it, I remember thinking, I was fairly young, and there was all kinds of e-commerce that was being promised. Everyone's going to buy everything online. You're not going to go into stores anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think to some degree that hasn't come true. Brick and mortar is so important for certain things. But obviously to a large degree, direct to consumer, online e-commerce is our whole lives. You know?
That's right.
And I was young, but I didn't know if I could see that. I would say, well, I'd want to be able to try things on or be able to feel it and touch it. And of course, the industry has evolved to figure out, free shipping both ways, and really interesting models like Warby Parker in glasses, in spectacles or in eyeglasses, changed the name of the game, allowing you to buy 4 pairs and send them all back, except for the ones you want. And it evolves. And at the time, though, of course, it probably seemed really unnatural.
It certainly did. It certainly shocked a number of my colleagues, especially my senior colleagues. I was in my first third of my practice, maybe starting the middle third of my practice. I've been in practice for 30 years, and I break it down in the first 10, second 10, and third 10. And now I'm starting my fourth 10. But yeah, during that second 10 is when I started my websites. And I purchased a number of URLs, and I would sit around and just brainstorm. And one day I bought 300 URLs.
I believe it. And smart up.
And even at this time, I still own, as you know, I own hundreds and hundreds of URLs, but I've bought and sold them. But I just kind of brainstormed what might be interesting to own, like property, like real estate. And then I'd start developing them. And at the height, I think I have 20, 25 websites at one point.
You're not far off from that right now, actually.
Well, yeah. Then you want me to tell you the story about the guerrilla marketing?
Well, so I think it's particularly interesting, obviously for our world, and I think Adam, is deep in the world of search engine optimization in Google. We all are. That's an area that he spent even more time than myself. And I think that it's particularly interesting to hear how primitive Google was at that time. And you just put up a website. Yeah, I'd love to hear that.
Well, we had the master site, which was Marina Plastic Surgery. Mm-hmm. And that's where I spent most of my time. But one day I was thinking about putting in a putting green in my backyard. And so I started looking at turf. Okay. And when I did, I found this particular site. And it wasn't the big one. I can't remember now the big one that everybody would recognize. It was this little one in North Carolina. And no matter where I searched, it came up. And then I noticed there was a lot of similarities between all these sites, and it kept driving me to the same site. And I was so fascinated in terms of my own site. I thought, how's he doing this? And so I literally called this guy up in Northern California. I said, could you tell me how it is that you're doing this? And he said, well, sure. Those are called gateway sites, doorway sites, he said, and they're just 3 pages. And I just create a few hundred of them. And every time you search or something, it comes up. And then, because he owned the first 2 or 3 pages when I would search.
Incredible.
And the big guy he was nowhere to be found. And so I thought, now that sounds really interesting. And I said, can I come out? Can you teach me how to do that? And so I studied what he did, and he had a few color palettes, and then he had a few geometric patterns like triangles, circles, rectangles, squares. And he created literally every permutation. If you had like 6 different color palettes and 5 different cut layouts and then so forth, and you could come up with a couple hundred different gateways or doorway sites. And so I did it. And all of a sudden, my site soared, and we didn't have geographical locators. Mm. So I was number 1 in the country, in front of Johns Hopkins and in front of every major company and every major university. If you wrote breast reduction, I came up first. If you wrote facelift. I came. There was no geographical locators in those days.
Can you imagine? Just because today the name of the game with Google is just hyper localization, but at that time
there was no localization.
That's a completely different era. It's amazing. What years were like? Was that in the late 90s,
late
early
90s,
2000s? Okay.
Late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah.
Because and Google wasn't a big deal at that time, and but as they started getting more powerful, I immediately was warned by the person who was helping me with my websites. He called me, and I didn't do it with his blessing, incidentally. And I had done it with my Freeze the Fat site also. And he called me and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" No, with my laser bra site. I did it with my laser bra site. He said, "What you're doing is going to get you blackballed." And I said, "Why?" And then he explained to me Google's rules as they were developing them. And I couldn't drop them fast enough. I was trying to drop them as fast as I could because I was so frightened of losing my status, because I had such recognition and longevity, because I started in 94 and 95
Right.
With my sites. So as soon as I realized that put my motherships in jeopardy, I started ditching those doorway sites, those 3-page doorway sites. So I did them for maybe a year and a half or 2 years. And they were fantastic. But that was in the Wild West when there were no rules.
right?
And content wasn't king. Once content was king, then if you duplicated content, you had problems, as you know, and you still do.
Yep.
Because we used the same content. We used the exact same content in all pages. Can you imagine a day when you write a paragraph and it'd be in 100 websites? The same paragraph.
Yeah, that's a different era. Very interesting.
Yeah, and clearly that's the easiest way for Google to raise the barrier to entry is just, making sure that duplicative content can't be utilized in that way.
Right.
And so, of course, they're going to make it a little harder to do that over time, but there's still a huge benefit to being a first mover. Like, I think in the turf example, you're basically saying the market leader hadn't jumped on this turf. Is that what you were saying?
That's right.
But this guy had.
Yes.
And that's the move.
That's right. So the little guy actually beat the big guy, and I basically imitated that for a while until I realized they changed the rules, and I better change my direction. And that's what it's been like ever since the beginning. They keep changing the rules, and we have to be nimble with experts like yourself and change our content and change our direction.
I'm fascinated with it. Adam and I talk about it all the time. Because you just don't always see it coming. Just like some of your peers did not see. It's very logical. This is a way that I can distribute media. Right now I'm having to carry around these slides. Now I can distribute this media to a much broader base, much simpler delivery right into their homes. I'm going to show them these before and after pictures. But people don't see that right away. And I try to look for, I think it's increasingly changing the difficulty for things like that to occur. But it's wild to just think about what is that next sea change? What is that next pivot? What is that next tipping point? Mm-hmm. And you have, the incumbents, and then you have kind of the newcomers, the Johnny-come-latelys that think they're so far away from being on top, and then something just shifts, and all of a sudden, I think Malcolm Gladwell talks about it in his book, The Tipping Point.
Yes.
And it kind of happened with, like, take YouTube. You have all these kids who are just messing around, making fun videos, and all of a sudden they're the millionaires of the world. Or take Bitcoin or whatever. You're there when it's unpopular. You're doing it when. Not because you're even really trying to be ahead of the curve. You're just doing it because you love it, and then all of a sudden that becomes the thing. Mm-hmm. So you were there early. I think from my conversations with you, I would say, because you're just a natural born marketer looking at these opportunities, and you kind of can't help yourself. You see that opportunity, you want to try it.
Right.
At one point, I think you told me that when you looked up certain keywords, it was just your site, your site, your site, your site.
That's correct.
That's what I mean about the primitive.
And then we also made people would say, "Why do you have multiple sites?" Well, I wanted to do procedure-driven sites. Because I thought, and people didn't search initially they would just search according to plastic surgery. And then I noticed their behavior changed. They started actually typing in what their problem was or the name of the surgery. They generally didn't know the proper name of the surgery. So they'd say nose job instead of rhinoplasty, right? Or boob job
the
instead.
layman's term.
And in those early days, search was not as strong. It was all about meta texts and so forth. So I ended up building these sites and building them around the procedure. And it made total sense then because people would search procedures. And so you might...
Still makes sense.
You might look for plastic surgery, and then I would come up, like 6 or 8 of my sites would come up on the first page. Yeah. And it might be laser bra, gummy bear breast implants, mommy makeover, marina plastic surgery, technology of beauty, and so forth. Because I had content built in each one of those that might address the search. And again, this is long before geographic search.
Just as a comment on that, that's kind of in the era where, as Google kind of started as a private company and then in the early 2000s kind of came into being, search, like you said, search was kind of primitive. And then as they evolved their product, you know, and Max and I, again, we've also talked about this, sort of without even the consumer knowing it, they started doing recommendation engines. They basically started teaching people, without them even realizing it, how to search on the internet.
I agree.
So instead of just searching surgeon or something like this, they started seeing, oh, when I type that in, I start getting these certain recommendations. And almost on a subliminal level, they made everyone learn how to search the internet better. And so that's kind of been an evolution of 20 some odd years now at this point, where now everyone's a pro searcher and they don't even know how they got there. So
yeah, I think it was an interesting sort of loop where people started searching a certain way. Google caught on to that and tailored its algorithms to that, and then people just started then, you know, seeing if there's a feedback loop where they then change the way they search based on that. But your initial insight into the way people search is it's still SEO 101. Maybe it's not through these micro doorway sites and it's just individual pages on your site, but really tailoring content to the way people think about it, where they're at in the pipeline, if you want to call it a sales pipeline. So I think it's still fascinating how much of those core concepts can still apply, even if a bit shifted.
And I think it's key that keep in mind that Google wants to maximize the consumer experience, and to anything they can do to make that consumer experience more efficient and more productive, they will do. So the flip side is, if a person tries to market by saying duplicating content, well, that doesn't make the user experience more productive. It actually wastes their time. Or likewise, if they want to purchase something and they want to stay in their area, which most people do, they then would search according to where they live, and they used to have to write it in. Now, as you know, the search happens around their geography automatically. Regardless. But if I say plastic surgeon near me or best plastic surgeon near me, up comes the geographical and you know the maps, and everybody knows what happens. But that's not the way it was initially in any way. That's been to maximize the consumer experience.
That's exactly right.
I'll say one other thing on that, which the modern equivalent of, it's interesting to hear that background, but the modern equivalent of whether you call it a gateway site, a doorway site, a micro site, I've heard all of those terms. For us, what we call it is we call it a specialty site, because in the modern version of what that is, it's not just an afterthought or a copied content that's thrown up on a URL. The modern way of doing it is exactly what you're saying, which is it's providing value. Google's job is to provide the value to the searcher of what they're really looking for. So if you're going to create a specialty site, which in our case, we normally recommend to any practice that they get a really strong main site. And then once they're really maximizing that, if they want to go after a specific procedure or a specific area, then they create a specialty site. But microsite is something we've removed as something we even talk about, because it implies something small.
It downplays it.
It downplays it, where really it's a robust site. It's a whole site dedicated to that specific thing you're focusing on. And that's it's still a strategy in modern times. And for what it's worth, you still have several sites.
You've done that for me.
Yeah, you have specialty sites. So,
right.
Yeah.
You've built on my sites and maximized them. So they're standalone sites.
Yep.
They address the consumer need. They talk about cost, location, financing, and things that people search and want to know about. It's not just before and after photos in a small site.
Exactly.
It's a standalone. So yeah, I don't like the term microsite either. Specialized site, I think, is a much better way.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, I just think it's really interesting. You have a very good insight and understanding of what I think are really core concepts that you have to have when dealing with Google or any search engine, because I think you said it, Adam. Google's job is to provide relevant results. If they stop providing relevant results for those people who are searching, which is everybody, then you're going to start using a different search engine, because when you type it in, you're not getting the thing you're looking for, which means they can't sell ads and they go out of business. So I think it's a fundamental core concept for us that there's a lot of tricks and secrets to SEO, but really it's just provide a great customer experience, a great user experience, and you're Google's best friend. Yes, this is the kind of content they want to serve up when people search for these things. So I just wanted to speak to that, because it's sort of our core philosophy on it is there are a lot of things, a lot of little details, but if you don't have a great experience, a great website, a fast website, one where they can get to their answers quickly, where that has great, robust content that is on point for what they're looking for, then the rest is all just trying to trick something. And that kind of SEO is out. It just doesn't last.
I thought of a couple other changes that happened when you were saying that.
Tell me.
You just reminded me of something. I distinctly recall calling up my webmaster at the time and saying to him, "Hey, I've got another idea." And I used to drive him crazy with my ideas. I probably still do. Probably drive you guys crazy, but you tolerate me a little bit better. And I said, "I just filmed some stuff, and it was with a camera. It wasn't with a phone. This was long before cell phones and with video, but I filmed it, and I said I want to put this on my website." And he literally said, "Video content website's never going to fly." And I said, no, I think it will. You got to check this out. I'll send it to you. I really want to put it all over my website. I want to interview patients, and I want to put them on my site. And he said, no, they're watching it all on their laptops, and they're not going to take the time, and they don't have enough horsepower to do it. We're not going to concentrate on video. And I had to force him to do it. And I could probably go back and find the emails if I looked hard enough, that video would never survive on the website. Now,
That's wild.
I was carrying a BlackBerry at the time, subsequent to that, and I said to him, "Listen, we have to redo these sites, and we have to make them compatible with these phones." And I'd switched to an iPhone, and I was carrying two. I was carrying an iPhone and a BlackBerry because I was used to the BlackBerry
So
key.
this is 2007-ish.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And he said, "No, there's not enough screen space. We need to just keep our content for the laptops." And I said, no, because obviously I would try to see it on the phone, and it was not compatible. What's the term you use in the business? Responsive. That's right. And we argued about making responsive sites. And there was a huge pushback. Were you guys in the business at that time?
For sure.
When you were switching people over?
Yeah.
And do you remember some people saying, "I don't want to have a responsive site"?
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Yes.
And yet, we all now live on these devices, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, when you think of search, when you said search, I was thinking, yeah, we do search. We search on our telephones.
Well, now that's the next way.
And this is our computer, really.
Yep.
And this.
Yep.
We're searching on our watches.
Wearables.
Mm-hmm. And so I do recall the pushback on video and the pushback on responsive sites.
That's really interesting, particularly on video. Was that before YouTube was really much of a thing? Do you remember?
I don't remember.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I think YouTube had already started, but I don't think it was.
Maybe it hadn't been acquired by Google.
Yeah, I
yet.
have to go back and recreate.
Yeah.
I don't think it was owned by Google at that point.
Yeah, that really changed the way we consume video on the internet at that time. I think the other you basically what you just touched upon is responsive, but then even after responsive, it's really mobile, and even after responsive, mobile has just even really only in the last 7 years or so really taken off as to where that's the majority of how we consume the internet.
Yeah, I don't know what the numbers are. What do you think the number of searches on a phone versus, say, a laptop or a tablet?
I mean, I could tell you that in around 2010, 2011, I distinctly remember seeing the shift. There was mobile traffic at that time, but I distinctly remember seeing the shift where we started seeing it go past 50% of traffic to most websites that we were managing. And then nowadays it depends on the website, but it's commonly 60, sometimes as high as 80%, depending on the website. It's the majority of traffic.
Well, there's two numbers, and I've seen them change in different industries, which is how much traffic to a site comes from mobile devices, and the other one is how much search. This is Google's number. How much search traffic, or how many searches are done on Google via a mobile device? Mm-hmm. Both are well over the 50% at this point, and it's industry. I've seen some numbers, Mary Meekers and so forth, where they talk about. The percentages varying by industry, but it's in the 60 to 70% most of the time, both the traffic and the search, which is really, really interesting. And the numbers in healthcare are really specifically pretty interesting. So
I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
And it's just going to continue rising.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that happened really kind of concurrent with the mobile shift is social media, obviously. Right? And I'd love to hear from your perspective. Again, you were here, you were doing it, you were an early mover. Social media was not a thing.
No.
Right. And then I don't know, is what's kind of how did you first foray into
Facebook would be the first for me. And I don't know the exact time. I'd have to go back and try to reconstruct it. Mm-hmm. But I distinctly remember sitting at the kitchen table and having my teenage daughter who was probably 16 at the time. She's 32. This is 16 years ago, having her tell me that Facebook was for her and her friends and that I shouldn't be on it. She saw what I was doing on it. And I was sitting, I remember where I was seated. I remember her telling me, that was made for us. You shouldn't be on Facebook. That's for us. That's not for you old guys. Dad, get off of Facebook. I don't know why you're, because I'd already started the Dr. Grant Stevens site for Facebook. And then was also starting the Marina Plastic Surgery on Facebook because I thought, well, this is terrific. There's people want to interact with other people and they want to know stories, and it's an extension of storytelling. And but it was but she lectured me, and then it happened again when I then was all over Facebook, and then her grandmother was on it, and she just was exasperated, and then Insta started. Right. And so when she saw that I had an Instagram account before she did, I got the same tongue lash.
You were done. It's interesting now because fast forward 15 years later, and Facebook is the platform of the older generation, keeping in touch with the grandchildren.
Yeah, it kind of continuously evolves. Like, you know, I honestly, we jokingly talk about how it's like a race of the younger generations trying to figure out a safe place where they're not being looked in upon by the older generations. So it essentially Facebook, and Facebook is the most universal one where still there's younger people, but it's oftentimes you're on Facebook in order to make sure that you can communicate with, you know, I talk with my 85-year-old grandfather via Facebook. But then Instagram is lower than that, and it's Snapchat, and then now it's TikTok. Everyone's on TikTok. That's the younger kids. So there will be another one. It's that continuing evolution of the newest platform and how people move to it. And again, like you said, it's all of them. They have the commonality that they're a medium of telling a story or communicate. You're basically, to do it right, what we say is you have to as a business or as a practice, you have to be like a publisher. You're creating content you're a content creator. You have to make something that's interesting and compelling in order to keep people interested in following you because you're creating that content that they find interesting. So that's as a business. As an individual, obviously it's sharing photos in your life and that kind of thing. But
well, it's the same thing. I always liken it to the media model has always been produce content that's interesting, that's not promotional, and insert advertisement here. It can be a magazine, it can be a blog or a website, it can be all kinds of things. Magazine's a good example though, because you're creating this content. You have journalists, you have editors, you have writers who are creating content. Someone comes to your door back in the day, sells you a magazine subscription. You love it. Maybe you're, and usually their affinity audience, they're niched down on a particular affinity audience. So maybe it's fishing, and you're a big fisherman, and so this is a great way as an advertiser for me to reach the people. If I manufacture fishing rods, I'm gonna go put out an ad in that magazine because this is the content that my target audience is consuming. Well, what's shifted in social media, Mark Zuckerberg and anyone who's benefited from these huge social media platforms, the biggest thing they've done that I think nobody's really realized is they turned all of us into their journalists, all of us into their content creators. That overhead and the ability to keep up with having to produce enough media so they can sell ads forever because there is so much content to consume. They need that surface area of content, as I kind of refer to it, in order to sell all of those ads. And before, media outlets, and we could talk about media forever, that's a whole broken industry that really needs to be re-envisioned today because the incentive models and so forth are completely broken. But social media, essentially, where you create content and you bring in, you're creating content around things that would be interesting to the people who you're targeting, and then the promotion is you. You get to, so you can do content marketing, shifting the old media model to you being the publisher, you creating the content that your target market is interested in, and then you just insert, your own promotion. So I think that that's a really interesting shift that's changed in the way that media works, which we could dedicate an entire episode to that because I study these things.
Yeah, well, you should.
Yeah, we certainly could.
That's a very interesting topic.
But in general, I'm obsessed, and I like to talk about these things with yourself and others who. So yes, Adam and I and our team have been in digital marketing for a long time, but I don't have the same level of experience of what it was like before, and really the stark change. I've been through some of them, and some of them I haven't, and I like to talk about those. and study, things that at the time you or others just was unassuming. There were a lot of people who said the internet wasn't going to be a thing, that the protocols that were being developed were, and today we talk about interesting things like blockchain and crypto, and people saying these aren't going to be things. So I don't know where I'm at on some of this. I'm looking and going, how do we learn from the lessons of the past to jump on these next things when they occur, which I just think is so fascinating. So I think it's particularly your insight is really interesting, particularly in the industry of aesthetics that we spend so much time in, and how it's changed for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then I know another thing that was a little more traditional types of media that you avenues and mediums that you used for this campaign, but was really interesting was Freeze the Fat. And that's another iconic campaign that you created that I also find so interesting. I see so many knockoffs of that these days. I'm driving behind a bus and there's a
Freeze your fat.
Or some variation. But they don't stick. They don't stick like Freeze the Fat does for me. So, I guess I know that was something that just everybody, even if I mention it today, okay, my friend Dr. Grant Stevens, and then I go,
Freeze the Fat guy.
100%. If they're not in aesthetics and they don't, they know Freeze the Fat. 100%. At least around here.
That was a ton of fun for me in terms of branding and marketing. I love to do this stuff. I think of brands and naming things and marketing. And what happened there is in 2009, I first heard about the concept of cryolipolysis, which is just a fancy schmancy way of saying to get rid of fat with cold. And I heard about it, and I actually spoke to the company, which at the time was Zeltique, now that's owned by Allergan. But I said, hey, can I try one of those things? And it wasn't even commercially available, and it wasn't FDA approved. And I started looking into it, and it fascinated me, just the technology of it. And the curiosity was, how is it that fat is uniquely so sensitive to cold, and the surrounding muscle and skin and bone and nerve and tendon is not? I thought, that's fascinating. I've never thought of that concept. And then I started getting into it and started, purchasing the device and started actually doing it on myself and other people and learning that it really did work. And then, of course, like always, my colleagues said, you're a plastic surgeon. You have liposuction. Why are you doing this? This is stupid. Then I knew I was onto something because once again I was deemed an outcast because I had this non-surgical approach for all these surgeons. And I thought, people are going to want to do things non-surgically if they can. And body contouring is something we've never done without a knife or, in this case, liposuction. So I thought it sounded fascinating. So I thought, well, what are we doing here? We're freezing fat. So I started Freeze the Fat. And freezethefat.com was born. And at that time, I had a couple machines, and I went on to actually buy, over time, 9 machines. And I've done more Coolsculpting than any human being on the planet Earth. And at one point, we had billboards and ESPN and famous people coming in asking me to freeze the fat. And we filmed it. We were on television all over the place, and we started Marina Manland. And it just kept going and going and going, and has. And now we have another company called Orange Twist, where we have centers where we do this in Southern California and Texas and Washington and Nevada. And we're going to be going all over the United States with Orange Twists. And the key thing is Freeze the Fat, which is Coolsculpting. And Coolsculpting itself has changed. But Freeze the Fat was a ton of fun. I was offered a lot of money a number of times to buy the site.
Is that right?
From individuals and companies, all different types of companies. And I've turned down every single offer because it's so successful. And I do license it out. I own it. I own the patent and the trademark, excuse me. But I do have colleagues around the country that I've allowed them to use it, such as Freeze the Fat Dallas or Freeze the Fat Santa Rosa with Paco and Heather Canales, or Jay Burns Freeze the Fat Dallas. And they license it from me for a real hefty fund of $1 a year. But they're my friends. They're board certified plastic surgeons and members of the Aesthetic Society. And I just feel like sharing the wealth. And the consumer public, if we look at who searches Freeze the Fat, it's all over the place.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a nationwide
And when
thing.
we did focus groups back when I was the chairman of the strategic advisory board for Zeltique, so I went on to work for the company, and Mark Foley, the CEO then, and had a blast doing it. But they did some studies. This was really great. We had 4 focus groups around the country, and we searched No, we had them talk about what they would search if they wanted to lose fat non-surgically. And of course, Coolsculpting wanted them to say Coolsculpting, or Zeltique wanted them to say Coolsculpting. In every focus group, the majority said freeze the fat before Coolsculpting. In those days, Coolsculpting was second to freeze the fat, and every focus group we did. It was hilarious. That did change eventually. They put in millions and millions of dollars into Coolsculpting, and then Allergan bought it, and the rest is history. So it is now the most searched term for that. Sure. But for years, it was not.
Interesting comment on that, because I know we've talked about this in other conversations we've had, because most of this, what we talked about so far today is digital marketing and social, but the Freeze the Fat campaign was what I would say is more holistic. It had a website, you did billboards, you had radio ads, you had, and oftentimes I think in any practice, sometimes you can get too focused in on one medium instead of really having a more holistic approach. You're looking for that one-hit wonder of marketing effort in order to get your patients. And I think part of why, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, part of why Freeze the Fat was so omnipresent is because you really went after it with a holistic approach, so much so that it became a part of pop culture. Like I think it was even in
Glee.
It was in Glee. It was in
right.
It was
Comedians with Cars.
Seinfeld.
Yeah.
It was in a Seinfeld episode. It was in an episode of Glee. Looks like someone needs to freeze the fat. And it was a kid that jumped up on her lap. Remember on Christmas time?
Yeah.
And Seinfeld
became ubiquitous.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, if there's anything you have to say, like, about just how you conceived that initial effort, because, like you said, that was before Zeltique or later Allergan was putting so much funds into creating broad brand awareness of Coolsculpting as a brand, but just kind of where your mind went with creating that in the beginning.
Well, you touched on a couple of things I think are really important. And when people interview me or when young plastic surgeons want to know how I got to where I'm at or what I would advise them to do, I'm quick to point out that what would be natural for you, but doctors don't necessarily think about this, that you have to have a campaign that has a certain duration. You can't just do it for a month and say it doesn't work. So the one thing is you have to be committed to a certain time.
Yeah.
The other thing is you need more than one medium, as you mentioned. You can't just be the guy on radio or the guy. I mean, you can if you want, but if you really want to brand something, you need to hit the various mediums. So you need to be social, internet, radio, TV, print, maybe even, although print would, for me right now, would be last on my list. But when we talk about Freeze the Fat, I knew I was going to do it for over a year. I budgeted it, and I decided to really hit it hard and make a commitment to hit all the different mediums. So the website, we didn't have social at that time.
And clearly it worked. I mean, you created a nationwide awareness of that by committing to that kind of.
And that was the fascinating thing for me, that it went across the nation. When we did the focus group, I think it was in Chicago, I was just floored at how many people there knew Freeze the Fat. And I never ran a campaign in Chicago.
Interesting.
I think again, it's universal truth in marketing that you really need to be willing to put a certain amount of effort into it. We see this where people knee jerk and they're not, they kind of pull back before it really has had a chance, and to really understand that campaign allocation and planning and really thinking ahead at how you're going to hit it from all channels is there's a really big lesson to be learned from that.
And that's a tough lesson for a lot of plastic surgeons, a lot of doctors in general, who don't have sophisticated marketing experience and or any training. You don't learn any of this in medical school. And we try at the Aesthetic Society to give a number of business courses and going into practice. We have a going into practice meeting even now to help arm the young plastic surgeons coming out now on just how to build their practice. And part of it is the marketing concept, just what you're saying. And it's counterintuitive to some of them that they're, quote, losing money and they have to keep spending money because they don't see the return on the investment right away. Right? And it's tough. And I'm sure for you guys, when you're selling the dream to them, you get to month 2 and 3, and if they're not seeing profit and they don't have any experience with this, you come to them on month 4 to pay you or to pay for their campaign, the Google search or whatever it is. I'm sure a lot of them start pulling back. And that's the opposite of what they should be doing.
Yeah, and I think it's more common today because there's so many, with digital marketing, there are so many ways to attribute and to measure analytics and really see how your campaigns are doing. And there's so much direct response advertising that is effective, and so people are maybe a little spoiled by that because it's effective, and you think, well, why would I do anything else except for what I can just immediately within the same week I can attribute my returns on that marketing. The problem is scale. It taps out at a certain point, and you go, what else can I do here? You really have to build an entire ecosystem through advertising in the market that you're trying to hit through multiple channels to build past that point of scale. And I think that's what people have a hard time giving up this or moving past the direct response, which is what we're all really trained to think with in digital marketing. So bringing these multidisciplines in, multidisciplinary approach to digital. Plus, we don't rule out a lot of traditional media that maybe some agencies go, we just know how to do this. But it's from lessons like what you did with Freeze the Fat that we can look at and go, okay, you have to build a runway. You have to have a runway to build the campaign. It's really cool. I also think it's fascinating. You were just telling the story of Zeltique and Coolsculpting, how, you essentially, I think, sort of made a career of going against the grain on these things that were not popular. Like you said, as soon as someone gave you some flack for it, you knew it was perfect.
Well, yeah, I have a core concept. Well, first, I have a number of them, but one of them is you're guaranteed to miss 100% of the shots you don't take. And so I'm not afraid of taking the shots, and I'm not afraid of failure. And the one thing I also know is reproducing and redoing what someone else is doing is never going to create a successful outcome. If they're already successful. I mean, imitation is not the way to have true success. It's changing the way people think and the way people are doing things. So when people push back on new ideas, typically I'm pretty happy about it. For instance, when we talk about drainless tummy tucks, and people say how crazy that is. And I say, I'm kind of happy you feel that way because your patients are actually coming to me. And I was just speaking up in Sun Valley, Idaho at the Northwest Society of Plastic Surgery. And they asked me to speak on my drainless tummy tucks. And I had a show of hands, and less than 20% of the people in the audience did that. And at the end, I said, show of hands, how many are willing to try it now? Because I've shared many years and thousands of patients in the experience, which is clearly superior to draining tummy tucks. There's no question. And a number of hands went up. But most importantly, one of my colleagues from Eugene, Oregon, who will remain unnamed for now, but you know who you are, he said, I have a laser pointer on your forehead right now. And I said, you do? He says, yeah, I want to shoot you with this laser pointer. I said, what do you mean? And he said, I just saw a patient of yours who came into my office to have a little something done, and I noticed she'd had a tummy tuck. And I said, wait a minute. And she's from Eugene. And he said, where'd you go for the tummy tuck? And she said, I went to Dr. Grant Stevens because he does the drainless tummy tuck and you don't. So, doing these things that are a little bit different actually brings you more patients.
Absolutely.
But safety first, though. I mean, just the number one thing is safety.
Yeah, so it sounds like, because I think you told me that story, or a similar story, where you spoke to an audience of your peers who, not many of them, a low percentage, were doing drainless. And it was after they heard in medical speak what you were doing there, not simply just someone trying to innovate for the sake of innovation, and why it was, and hearing from yourself, they were confident they could do it. There's some trepidation about being the first, maybe, but I think it was after they heard your approach and your insights into it that they felt comfortable
and why it works.
Right?
And it's not just not putting in a drain. There's other things. The progressive tension sutures. There's other things we do to compensate for not having the drain. Right. And it's that which optimizes the appearance of the abdomen and eliminates the painful drains and the hassle of the drains and so forth. So it's not just not putting in a drain. There's the progressive tension sutures are the key thing that allows for drainless tummy tucks. But we don't talk about it that way when we're marketing. It's just drainless tummy tucks.
Right.
You follow the difference? Yeah. We don't say progressive tension sutures. The consumer doesn't know what a progressive tension suture is.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, you have a lot of interesting stories like this, I feel like, particularly when you talk about, I don't know, if there's other technologies that you feel like along with Coolsculpting that you were the early adopter, but I know in general you're willing to push the envelope and try new technologies. You participate in FDA studies, and I think that we're seeing a trend now in the med spa space, in dermatology, in aesthetics, non-surgical aesthetic enhancement that you were also on the forefront of. I don't know if there's anything there you would want to speak to.
Well, we think about non-surgicals. I started my first med spa in 1989.
Wow.
and provided injectables, which was collagen, which was Zyderm and Zyplast, and facials, and was roundly criticized. I can remember being told, "You're not a dermatologist, you're a plastic surgeon." And in 1994, I started my first lasering, CO2 lasers. I did a laser in 1983, a pulsed dye laser for a port wine stain, and I was really captivated with the technology of lasers and laser science. So I continued with it. In 1994, I started doing laser resurfacing with a carbon dioxide laser. We didn't have fractionated or pixelated lasers in those days. They were fully ablative. And people thought I was nuts because I wasn't a dermatologist and I was a plastic surgeon, and we incorporated it into plastic surgery. And out of that came resurfacing, and that started the laser bra, and taking a patient's own tissue and taking the outer skin off of it and keeping it alive and affixed to the patient, and actually creating an internal bra with the CO2 laser, which I still do today.
Yeah, it's cool. Bringing that technology into surgery as well.
Mm-hmm. And out of that, and the lasers kept changing, and now we have fractionated lasers, meaning we like pixelation, so it's rapid recovery, and there's a lot of different technologies in the laser and light-based technology area. But in addition to that, there are other really fascinating things that are happening, from sweat reduction and odor reduction, and not just mirror dry, but there's other new companies coming along. When you look at cellulite treatment, and we've been through endomology and Velismooth and the other ones, and then cellulase, and then Sulfina, and now there's 2 or 3 others on the horizon that I can't talk about that are about to hit the market. And cellulite's a big problem for women. It's one of the most frequent things I get asked about, and up until now we really don't have a great solution, but we have some nice ones coming along.
That's exciting. And I think, so you were telling me, and I happen to know, I don't know if you'll let me leak it out here, but you're going to be releasing your own podcast as well.
Yes.
And it's kind of, a lot of the subject matter will be around these topics, right? That you want to tell us the name of the podcast?
Sure. It's Technology of Beauty. I've had that name since before the internet. I actually registered that name in the early 90s because I'm so captivated by technology, and marrying technology with beauty. And so we have a website, Technology of Beauty, but I'm going to start my own podcast, Technology of Beauty, and interview experts in the field, such as yourself, and industry experts, physicians, maybe even some patients, and just exploring the various ways that technology can be used, has been used, will be used to optimize appearance of men and women, not just women. So Technology of Beauty will be the new podcast.
I'm really excited about it. I know you have a unique view and vantage point on these things, not only from your career and being, an early mover in a lot of these technologies when they were nascent, but also you mentioned to me the other day that you might have the opportunity to bring one of the inventors, really the bio technologists behind some of these products, which I think is such a fascinating. I got the opportunity to meet with a fellow the other day.
That's
you
right.
Introduced me to.
Yeah, I've had the good fortune along the way of meeting a lot of the minds, the brains that invented these technologies. And I have not invented any of the technologies per se. I've utilized them and marketed them and found places to use them for patients. But I look forward to bringing some of the people into my program, into my podcast, that actually had the idea of the technology and developed it, and the course they went through. And it's a tough deal. I've been involved now in startups, and it's full of failures, and raising money and trying and saying, dusting yourself off and going in and trying it again. If it were easy, everybody would do it.
Absolutely. I imagine you also have some interesting perspective to offer to some of these creators, in that you're sort of the conduit between the creator and the consumer, what they want to solve, what hasn't worked. You're looking at these results progressively over time and seeing what really holds and what doesn't. So is that kind of an interesting perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a meeting that we're having, the third meeting of it. It's called Aesthetic Innovation Summit, or AIS, Aesthetic Innovation Summit. And we bring industry, which would be the companies that make the products and so forth, along with finance, or the money behind it, and clinicians like myself, all into one room, and review things that are available, things that are coming out in the near future, new technologies, and it's been very popular. The meeting is around the aesthetic surgery meeting. This year it's on April 24th in Las Vegas. April 23rd in Las Vegas. And we have with us, actually, I am going to be interviewing Mr. Richard Gonzalez, who is the CEO of AbbVie, and AbbVie just purchased Allergan for a mere $67 or $62 billion.
Right.
And everyone wants to know what Mr. Gonzalez is going to do with Allergan and his commitment to the aesthetic space. And I was able to meet him the other day, and we had a lovely lunch, and he has agreed to let me interview him in a fireside chat and let everybody get to know this gentleman who's never been in the aesthetic space. And it's going to be a lot of fun.
That's going to be fascinating.
I'd love to put him on my podcast. Wouldn't that be great?
Absolutely.
I would definitely want to hear that. I will say I had the benefit of going to AIS last year, and absolutely fascinating event. Incredible. I think it's relatively new, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
We did our first one in New York 2 years ago, and then last year, where you were there, we did New Orleans, and this year it's going to be Las Vegas. It's right around the Aesthetic Society meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an incredible meeting. Anyone who's listening to this, it's obviously for industry related people who are creating software or products for the industry. But if you're lucky enough to be able to get in the door, it's an incredible source of information.
And as you saw, it's basically standing room only.
Yeah.
And every year it grows. And we've already had a lot of people apply. Industries and companies applied. And we give them some little slots, little companies that have these ingenious ideas and don't have the financing. And then you have the finance guys there, the Craig Drills of the world, and they're there and they're looking for new things to get involved in.
Yeah.
It's really an amazing networking day. And who knows, maybe it'll be 2 days next year.
Yeah, that'd be amazing.
I could see it growing to 2 days. Yeah, as Adam mentioned, we had the pleasure of going to the second meeting of AIS, and completely different perspective from other aesthetic shows, getting to see inside of industry. And for me, I felt particularly honored to be able to be there and enjoyed it so much because it gives me a look ahead.
Right.
And there were some marketing components, aspects. So that's always what I'm looking at the most. And there's marketing technologies, either presenting or we're just kind of rubbing elbows with people in that space who are moving things ahead. And it's really fascinating. So I think that's so cool that you're doing that and helping.
It's a ton of fun.
Yeah. It's fantastic.
That's why I hope to do more and more of in my next life.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk to you about what you're up to these days. You're kind of coming towards the end of your first year as the immediate past president of the Aesthetic Society.
Yes, I am.
I'd love to hear what you're up to and what you're planning, and also kind of tell us a little bit about some of the things you did when you were president in the Aesthetic Society.
Well, I had a wonderful time. I had the honor and privilege of serving as the president of the Aesthetic Society, and during that time, I was able to work with my board and work with other very talented people in the society and affect changes that set the society up for the future with rebranding, new logo, brands, website, and being far more inclusive to include younger people and women and racially diverse people and international members. We did a number of things to make the process easier. So it wasn't so laborious to get into the society. Some of the old guard say we lowered the bar, and we didn't lower the bar at all. We just made it more efficient and easier to get through the process. And if you look at the membership, it's swelled. The percentage of women, all-time high. Percentage of international and number of international people, all-time high. Average age for the first time in over a decade went down. Our society was aging out. And we were able to turn that around. So our average age went down, our membership went up. All the changes we wanted, or I certainly was dedicated to and committed to when I became president, every one of them was achieved.
That's fantastic. I got to spend some, we had a few meetings here and there. You were rather busy at that time, but I would see you here and there. Yeah. I would see here and there. You would tell me some of the things you were working on. I could see personally how passionate you were about it. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective. This was a duty for you. Mm-hmm. I could see that. And it sounds like you made really good use of your time there, hearing about those membership numbers and the membership numbers among women, among internationals. That's really cool. Also, I happen to love the new branding too.
Great.
that I know you 100% led that charge.
I'm glad you do.
Yeah, I love it.
And our chair people now are women. I was able to appoint more chair women or chair people
cool.
as women. And also, we'll have our first female president now at long last in 2 years from now.
That's great.
3 years from now, beg your pardon. And then we have another woman president coming thereafter. So, we're shedding the old image of a bunch of old white guys.
Right. Yeah. It's great to see. It's really cool. So now you're almost a year out from that. Am I right?
Yes. Yeah. I'm finishing my immediate past president. I'm the chairman of the board of trustees, and I'll be retiring in that position here in April. And I'll still be on the board of trustees, but I won't be the chairman. So I'll still be involved as the board of trustees and hopefully involved in other capacities where needed and so forth. But I'm kind of morphing myself. I'm slowing down the surgery and seeing primarily established patients, not really looking for a whole lot of new patients. I will see friends and family of established patients. But I'm working on developing other companies, sitting on boards, being a consultant, and doing the various things we've talked about, like the aesthetic innovation. I also manage a fund, angel fund, an aesthetic innovation angel fund called SOAR, and that's been a lot of fun to help fund some of these emerging technologies.
That sounds really fun. That's SOAR, SOAR?
Right.
Okay.
It's a double entendre on purpose. It's soaring like an eagle, but the other use of soar can't be lost in it. But no, it's SOAR. It's soaring like an eagle.
That's awesome.
SOAR Capital.
It sounds like a great way to leverage all of the knowledge and relationships you have, and to really also, all these things you're doing, paying it forward to the next generation to really, again, I know that this is a calling for you, that I've really been inspired by seeing how passionate you are about really helping your peers.
Well, along those lines, I have to tell you, the thing that gives me the most satisfaction is my fellowship, my aesthetic fellowship. And you guys were at the aesthetic fellowship dinner last year. And I am celebrating my 20th year as the director and founder of the Marina Aesthetic Fellowship. And now it's the Marina Rocks USC, because we have Jay Calvert and the physicians at Roxbury. And then we have USC. We're now part of the USC system. But it's still the fellowship I started 20 years ago. And trained over 35 aesthetic fellows who are out around the country and the world practicing aesthetic surgery and medicine. And it gives me so much delight to watch them soar all around the country. And they're starting their fellowships now. So I'm stepping down as the chairman of that also this next year.
Wow. Well, it sounds like you have no shortage of things you're working on these days. As usual, I know you. I know how you are.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's exciting.
Well, I love doing it. I stay busy doing it.
Yeah. Really great.
It's not work when you love doing it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's how I feel.
Yeah,
that's how we feel with what we do. I mean, it's always evolving. It's always changing. You have to be on the pulse. You couldn't do it if you didn't love it. You could do it for a while. You wouldn't stay up with it, though. You got to really kind of just eat, breathe, sleep this stuff.
Passionate, right?
Passion.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
You've got to be on the tracks to get hit by the train, right?
and we could do a whole nother podcast just around that subject of passion, being passionate about what you do. But I think this has been really inspiring. Thank you for coming in and telling us, your story of your stories of how the industry has evolved and around you, and how you've evolved with it and led the way. It's very inspiring, and I think people will really enjoy having.
Well, it's been a pleasure, an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Stevens.